Hi, how are you? And welcome to part 2 of Sleeping Beauty. Aren't y'all excited? Do y'all remember what was the last thing that happened on Tuesday? Well, Aurora got really upset during her birthday party about finding out that she was a princess and she was betrothed. But what she doesn't know is the man that she met in the woods is the man she's betrothed to. That's a little spoiler alert. So let's get started with the rest of Sleeping Beauty, Jocelyn. You ready? Yeah? All right. Chapter 6. King Hubert gobbled down another piece of cake. Laid out before him was a feast fit for a king. 2 kings to be exact. The royal table was overflowing in celebration of Princess Aurora's return. But for all of King Hubert's appetite, King Stephen had not eaten a thing. He paced on the floor anxiously, looking out the window for the 100th time. Outside, it was gloomier than ever. Maleficent's thunder practically shook the ground, which was a good sign. It was getting late, and soon Aurora's birthday would be over. No sign of her yet, Hubert, King Stephen said. Course not, King Hubert said in a mid-chew. There's a good half hour till sunset. Come, man, buck up. The battle's over. The girl's as good as here. King Stephen exhaled deeply. I'm sorry, Hubert, but after 16 years of worrying and never knowing. All in the past, King Hubert reassured him. Gobbling a bottle of wine, he poured 2 glasses. Tonight, we toast the future. They raised their glasses and clinked them together. To the future, Hubert, King Stephen said, a smile growing across his face. To the marriage of our children and the uniting of our kingdoms. And to the new home, huh? King Hubert said. New home? King Stephen asked. King Hubert snapped his fingers. And an attendant quickly ran over with a thick roll of parchment. As King Hubert unfurled it and unfolded it, King Stephen stared in amazement. It was the plans for an enormous castle. 40 bedrooms, a dining hall, honeymoon cottage, all built and ready to go. King Hubert beamed proudly at the plans. The lovebirds can move in tomorrow. And Jocelyn, what do you think about that? Tomorrow? King Stephen put his glass down in shock. But Hubert, they're not even married. Ha! We'll take care of that tonight. King Hubert poured some more wine and raised his glass again. To the wedding! He's in a hurry. Hold on, Hubert, King Stephen said. I haven't even seen my daughter yet, and you're taking her away from me? You're getting my fill-up, aren't you? King Hubert asked. And we want to see our grandchildren, don't we? Well, yes, of course, King Stephen replied, but be reasonable. Aurora knows nothing about this, and it may come to something of a shock to her. King Hubert suddenly smashed his glass down on the table. Shock? My Philip a shock? What's wrong with my Philip? Nothing, King Stephen protested. I'm only meant, why doesn't your daughter like my son? King Hubert haruffed. I'm not so sure my son likes your daughter. I'm not sure my grandchildren want you for a grandfather. King Stephen was furious. Now see here, you unreasonable, pompous, blistering on windbag. Windbag? King Hubert shouted. His face was red with anger. He reached out to grab a weapon, anything. The first thing his fingers clenched was a cooked fish. On guard, sir. He thrust toward King Stephen with a fish, grabbing a platter like a shield. King Stephen said, I warn you, Hubert, this means war. Forward! King Hubert screamed. He raised the fish high and brought it down over King Stephen's head. For honor, for country, for splat! The fish squashed against King Stephen's platter. The two kings stopped. They both looked at the lampfish and the limp in the King Hubert's hand. King Stephen tried as hard as he could to hold back a laugh. But it was too late. King Hubert exploded with a and in an instant, both kings were shaking with laughter. What's this all about anyway? King Hubert said. Our children are bound to fall in love with each other, huh? Precisely, King Stephen agreed. As they picked up their glasses again for another toast, a herald's voice sounded from the courtyard. His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, he cried. Excuse me, Stephen, King Hubert said. He bolted out of the dining room and ran into the courtyard. There atop a great white horse was a handsome young man in damp clothes. Damp clothes, Villagers and servants looked at him in admiration, and many a young woman tried to catch his attention. But Prince Philip had only one person in mind. The lovely girl who he had danced with in the forest. The girl whose name he did not even know. Steady, Samson, he said as he dismounted. Philip, King Hubert shouted as he approached his son. Hurry, boy, change into something suitable. Can't meet your bride looking like that. But I have met her, father, Prince Philip said with a huge grin. You have? I know, huh, Jocelyn? Where? King Hubert asked. Prince Philip lifted his father high into the air and began dancing with him. Once upon a dream. Philip, stop that! King Philip splattered as the townspeople started to laugh. Put me down! Prince Philip lowered his father to the ground. Actually, father, it wasn't a dream, Philip said. I really did meet her. King Hubert's eyes brightened. You met the Princess Aurora? Good heavens, we must tell Stephen. Why, this is the most extraordinary. I didn't say it was Aurora, Prince Philip said calmly. I said I met a girl I was going to marry. I don't know who she is. A peasant girl, I suppose. A peasant girl? The color began to drain from King Hubert's face. You're gonna marry why, Philip? You're joking. He looked at Samson. Isn't he? Samson shook his head no. King Hubert was now white with shock. No! You can't do this to me! Give up the throne, the kingdom for some nobody? I won't have it! You're a prince and you're gonna marry a princess! He blustered. Now, father, Prince Philip said smoothly, you're living in the past. This is the 14th century nowadays. Nowadays, I'm still the king, King Hubert thundered, and I command you to come to your senses and marry the girl I love, Prince Philip cut in. Exactly, King Hubert blurted. Prince Philip smiled and quickly mounted Samson. Goodbye, father, he called out. King Hubert suddenly realized what he had said. Marry the girl you know! No, Philip, stop! Come back! But Prince Philip had already on his way. He wasn't going to have his marriage arranged for him. 16 years ago, Princess Aurora had been a little baby. He had no idea what she was like now, but he knew she couldn't be as lovely or sweeter than the girl he'd met today. But he doesn't know. This evening at the cottage in the glen was what the girl had said, and Philip intended to be there. Chapter 7. Aurora shivered as she crossed the bridge to the castle. The hood she was wearing didn't seem to keep out of the chilly air. Around her, the three fairies walked on tiptoes. They wanted no one to see or hear them. Princess Aurora. She repeated her new name in her mind, but it was hard to think of herself as anything but Briar Rose. How different everything would be now. As they approached the castle, Briar Rose was astonished by its grandeur. It was breathtaking. It rose up against the light of the low orange sun and seemed to touch the clouds. After so many years in the modest little cottage, Aurora could scarcely believe that this was her real home. But still, she couldn't help thinking about the young man she'd left in the forest. Right about now, he'd be arriving at the cottage to meet her. She imagined the look on his face when he found her gone. Would he be hurt? Angry? It didn't matter, she told herself. She would never see him again. She was engaged to be married to someone she knew nothing about. They crossed the empty courtyard and came to a heavy wooden door at the base of the castle. Flora opened it and waved the others inside. "Come along now," she urged. They walked up a winding set of stairs that looked and took them to a small dark room. "Bolt the door, Merryweather," Flora whispered. "Fauna, pull the drapes." As the two fairies scurried about, Flora gently led Aurora to a seat before a large mirror. Waving her magic wand, she chanted, "This one last gift, dear child, for thee, the symbol of thy royalty, a crown to wear in grace and beauty, as thy right and royal duty." In a whirl of magic sparkles, a gold crown appeared on Aurora's head. It was light and delicate, yet it glittered with many fine jewels. The fairies sighed happily as Aurora turned to face the mirror. The girl in the reflection was a stranger to Aurora. She was a princess now, not Briar Rose. She knew she felt thrilled. From now on, life would be full of fine clothes and wonderful feasts. But what good was all of that if she couldn't share it with her true love, Jocelyn? A tear formed in the corner of Aurora's eyes. She saw it in the mirror, and suddenly she couldn't hold her sadness in any longer. With an anguished sob, she buried her face in her arms and wept. "Come," Flora said sadly to the other fairies. "Let her have a few moments alone." Quietly, they left the room. "It's that boy she met," Merryweather whispered. "Whatever are we going to do?" Flora asked. They sat on a bench against the wall outside Aurora's room. "Oh, I don't see why she has to marry any old prince," Merryweather said. "Now, that's not for us to decide," Flora replied. As the three fairies walked outside, the fireplace inside Aurora's room suddenly grew dark. Aurora lifted her head and saw a small green ball of glowing light where the fire had been. The moment she looked at it, she couldn't take her eyes away. The light glowed brighter in the fireplace. Aurora rose from her seat as if she pulled by an invisible force. Sorrow and grief left her face. Her expression became blank. Suddenly and mechanically, she walked into the fireplace. Can you spot Aurora's crown? Shrouded in black, a dark image appeared around the light. It lured with evil triumph, then disappeared. Aurora's glazed eyes did not notice the unmistakable grin of Maleficent. Outside, the thunder and lightning surrounding Maleficent's castle stopped for the first time in 16 years. It was Flora who first noticed the change in the weather. In the strange quiet, her ears picked up the sound of shattering feet inside Aurora's room and a low, familiar laugh she hadn't heard in years. "Listen!" she cried in alarm. "Maleficent!" Merryweather and Fauna jumped up and ran for the door, shouting, "Rose! Rose!" They all burst into the room just in time to see Aurora step through an archway at the back wall of the fireplace. As she stepped into the corridor behind and the solid wall reappeared, Aurora was gone, Jocelyn. She was gone. The fairies pounded the wall with their fists. "Oh, why did we leave her alone?" Flana moaned. "Oh, here," Flora said, remembering her wand. She waved it at once and the wall disappeared. The fairies raced through. They found a stone staircase that spiraled up toward the castle's tallest tower, a smoking green light flickering in the stairwell's shadows, then disappeared. "Rose!" they yelled, running up to the next floor. "Where are you?" Surely Maleficent was taking the princess into one of the castle's many empty rooms. But which one? On each floor, there were so many rooms, so many other staircases going in so many different directions. They scattered around, trying each one. In the middle of a small empty room at the top of the tower, the green light stopped moving. So did Aurora. I know, Jocelyn. What's going to happen, Joss? What do you think? The frantic footfalls of the fairies echoed frantically outside the room, but Aurora was not aware of them. She stared blankly at the light transformed. It began to glow and change shape until at last a spinning wheel stood before her. On it, a long spindle glistening with unearthly light. Slowly, she reached her finger toward it. "No! Rose!" came the fairies' voices. "Don't touch anything!" The words were loud and strong. They broke through the witch's spell ever so slightly. Aurora drew back her hand. "Touch the spindle," Maleficent hissed, invisible in the darkened room. "Touch it, I say." Aurora's eyes glazed over once again. She reached toward the binding white pinpoint. Out in the hallway, Merryweather heard the witch's horrible voice. "In here!" Merryweather cried, pointing to the room. Together, the fairies barged in. Is she gonna touch it? As the door crashed open, they gasped. There in the cloud of smoke stood Maleficent. Her cape bellowed around her, covering most of the room in folds of deep, lifeless black. "You poor, simple foos," she snarled, "thinking you could defeat me. Me, the mistress of all evil, Jocelyn." Neither Flora, Fauna, or Merryweather could find the words to answer. Their eyes searched the room for Aurora, but they could see nothing behind the cape. With one strong sweep that sent a blast of frigid air through the room, Maleficent pulled her cape aside. Her voice was a vicious rasp. "Well, here's your precious princess." In the smoky swirl, Aurora lay motionless on the floor. Her eyes closed. I know, Jocelyn. Chapter 8. The princess was due to appear at any moment. In the throne room, courtiers, ladies in waiting, and servants buzzed around the king and queen. Everyone was happy except for King Hubert. He paced the floor, wondering how to break the news that Prince Philip had run off to meet a peasant girl. Then suddenly a herald's jubilant voice sounded above the din. "The sun has set. Make ready to welcome your princess." A deafening blast of fireworks sounded and the sky lit up. The throne room fell silent and King Stephen and Queen Leah looked anxiously toward the door. With a sigh, King Hubert decided to tell them about Prince Philip's new love. King Hubert didn't know that the peasant girl and the princess were one and in the same person. Nor could he know that she now lay motionless on a soft bed, surrounded by the three fairies, who were her aunts. "The poor king and queen," Fauna said, weeping. Merryweather shook her head sadly. "They'll be heartbroken when they find out." But Flora was busy hatching a plan. She remembered Merryweather's gift to the baby Aurora so long ago. Do you remember what the fairy Merryweather's gift was? Does that mean Aurora is gone or sleeping? And from this slumber you shall wake, when one true's love kiss, the spell shall break. King Hubert looks so sad, doesn't he? But he's got a surprise coming, doesn't he? If they can only find the young man Aurora had met, perhaps his kiss would bring her back to life. In the meantime, there was a way to keep the king and queen from heartbreak. We'll put them all to sleep until Rose awakens, Flora said. The others agreed. At once, they transformed themselves into tiny specks of light, and they flew out the window, sparkling magic dust over the entire courtyard. The dust glittered and fell, looking like a part of the fireworks display. It settled over the townspeople and the court guards. Each of them fell asleep instantly. In seconds, the courtyard was filled with slumbering bodies. Flora reached the throne room first. As she blanketed the room with magic dust, she heard King Hubert say, "You see, Stefan, I've been talking to Philip. Seems he's fallen in love with some peasant girl." With a yawn, he put his heavy head on the arm of King Stefan's throne. Flora couldn't believe what she was hearing. She dove down next to him, flying close to his ear, and she whispered, "Peasant girl? Who is she? Where did he meet her?" "Oh," he said, yawning again. "Just some peasant girl he met once upon a dream." "Once upon a dream?" Flora repeated. Those were the same words Aurora had used after she met the young man in the woods. Could it be? Could he have been Prince Philip? Flora remembered that Aurora had invited him to the cottage that night. If the prince's love for Aurora was as true as her love for him, perhaps his kiss would break the dreadful spell. Flora dotted up to the chandelier where Fauna and Merryweather hovered. "Come on," Flora urged. "We've got to get back to the cottage." Like three tiny shooting stars, the fairies sped over the still courtyard. Deep in the woods, Prince Philip approached the cottage door. Feeling nervous for the first time in his life, he adjusted his cap, then readjusted it. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. "Come in," called a soft female voice. Who is it, I wonder? Prince Philip opened the door and stepped in. At first, he didn't see anyone. Suddenly, the door closed behind him. "Yeah!" With blood-curdling shrieks, his team of small, vicious creatures pounded on him. He fell to the ground, his cap flying off. Prince Philip fought fiercely, and he was outnumbered. The creatures skidded around him, tying him up with strong twine. As he scuttled and kicked and struggled, the tall figure of Maleficent materialized before him. Above her, the raven perched on a rafter. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise," Maleficent said in a low, cruel voice. "I set my trap for a peasant, and lo, I catch a prince." As she cackled with glee, Prince Philip felt an icy chill run through his veins. "Away with him!" Maleficent commanded her creatures. "But gently, my pets, gently. I have plans for our royal guest." Howling with laughter, the ghoulish creatures pushed the helpless prince out the door. Chapter 9. By the time the fairies got to the cottage, all that was left of Prince Philip was his cap. Maleficent, they all said at the same time, right, Jocelyn? She's got Prince Philip. Merryweather cried. At the Forbidden Mountains, Flora added. Fauna's eyes widened in horror. But we can't go there. In spite of their magic powers, the fairies had never dared venture into Maleficent's domain. We can, Flora said firmly, and we must. Without another word, the fairies went off. They raced out of the cottage and into the darkness of the Forbidden Mountains. The jagged spirals of Maleficent's decaying castle loomed closer. The fairies quickly flew past the crumbling stone bridges and the hard winged gargoyles. A chilly wind pitched them right and left as they flew in and out of broken remnants of the castle walls. The fairies could hear loud screeches coming from one wing of the castle. They flew toward the noise at once, hiding on a deep window ledge. Their tawny faces flickered with red and orange as they watched a crackling bonfire in the room below. Maleficent's creatures danced wildly around the fire, screaming so loudly that the fairies had to cover their ears. Ah! Watching the bonfire coolly from her throne, Maleficent smiled. What a pity Prince Philip can't be here to enjoy the celebration, she said. She turned her raven and talked, who sat contently on her shoulder. Come, we must go to the dungeon and cheer him up. She rose from the throne and walked out of the room carrying her staff. The fairies fluttered silently behind, following her and the raven through a long, cavernous hallway and down a deep, drafty stairwell, Jocelyn. At the bottom, Maleficent pushed open a heavy wooden door. Inside was a slumped figure of Prince Philip. He sat on a bench across the room, his wrists and ankles shackled to the wall with chains. Oh, come now, Prince Philip, Maleficent said as a wicked smile crossed her lips. Why so melancholy? A wondrous future lies before you. She tipped her staff toward him. Its crystal ball began to glow with an image of Aurora motionless on her bed. Behold, King Stephen's castle, Maleficent said, and in yonder topmost tower, dreaming of her true love, is the Princess Aurora. Prince Philip gasped. Surprised? Maleficent taunted. Yes, it is the same peasant maid who won the heart of our noble prince just yesterday. But have no fear, I shall let you go someday. The gates of the dungeon shall part, and you will ride violently away to awaken your love with true love's kiss. The image changed. Now the crystal ball showed the prince as a stooped, white-haired old man entering the castle grounds on a limping horse. That means she says he's going to be there a while. Prince Philip gritted his teeth. He pulled at his chains violently, but they held fast. Maleficent only laughs. Come, my pet, she said to her raven. Let us leave our noble prince with these happy thoughts. The fairies flew into a crack in the wall as Maleficent walked out the door. A most gratifying day, the witch purred, slamming the dungeon door behind her. For the first time in 16 years, I shall sleep well. When Maleficent was gone, the fairies flew out of the crack, waving their wands, and they returned to normal size. Prince Philip looked up with a start. Who? Shh, Flora insisted. No time to explain. With a stroke of their magic wand, she and Fauna destroyed his chains, and Merryweather did the same to the lock on the door. Finally free, Prince Philip hopped to his feet. His eyes burned with vengeance as he bolted for the door. Wait, Prince Philip! Flora warned. As he turned to her, she waved her wand again. The road is true love may be bound by many dangers, so arm thyself with these. In a shower of crystal light, a glittering sword and shield appeared in Prince Philip's hands. Take this enchanted shield of virtue and this mighty sword of truth, Flora continued, for these weapons of righteousness will triumph over evil. Prince Philip took firm hold of the weapons, and with grim determination, he led the fairies upstairs. But when they reached the top, a loud squeak perched the air. The raven, who had been standing guard, now flew quickly toward the throne room. There was a little time left. The prince and the fairies raced blindly through the maze of dark archways and winding corridors. Before long, there was a clamor of footsteps and shouting behind them. The fairies quickly shrunk themselves down again, and his heart racing, the prince rounded a corner at top speed. "Rah!" came an inhuman cry as a team of Maleficent's goons ambushed him. The prince unshielded his sword. Single-handedly, he fought the creatures, and the corridor echoed with the clinking of metal against metal. Out of the corner of his eye, Prince Philip spotted a window high above him. With a mighty thrust, he threw and he drove the creatures back. Then he leaped onto the ledge. The evening mist curled around his face. He couldn't see down to the ground, but he did see another long, broken ledge that led away from the window. It was Prince Philip's only chance for escape. He stepped onto the ledge, and in the shifting fog, he saw a turret to his left. I know. Is Prince Philip gonna reach Princess Aurora? We shall see, Jocelyn. Inside it, he could see Maleficent's guards frantically aiming their bows and arrows at him. Below him, he heard Samson whining. There was no time to think. He jumped. The prince landed on a mount of earth. He slid down to the bottom and found himself in a courtyard of broken stone. Samson stood shackled to a wall a few feet away. "Philip, watch out!" came Flora's voice. Prince Philip's eyes shot upward. Maleficent's warriors lined the castle's walls with a rumble that shook the ground. Heavy black boulders were being hurried toward him. Even a shield wouldn't protect him from those. Flora waved her magic wand, sending fairy dust toward the rocks. Zing! They instantly changed into delicate bubbles that floated harmlessly away. Merryweather shot fairy dust at Samson's shackles, breaking them to pieces, and Prince Philip hopped on his saddle, and Samson spread across the courtyard. The creatures were screaming with anger. From the turret down, they shot a barrage of arrows at the prince, and from directly overhead, they poured out a vat of boiling oil. But the fairies were ready. Zing, zing! The arrows became lovely flowers, and the oil changed to an arch rainbow. Philip gambled right underneath it at full speed. A small shadow streaked over Merryweather's head. She looked up to see the raven. "You!" she muttered angrily. Clenching her wand, she began to chase him. The raven dodged in and out of the castle spirals and gargoyles, and Merryweather shot fairy dust at the bird again and again, but missed each time. Finally, as he flew behind a tower, she simply hovered and waited. When he emerged, lightning on a ledge near the front door, zing! She got him. A stone statue of a raven now glowered at the door. As Merryweather darted away, Maleficent stalked angrily out the door. Glancing at the stone raven, she shouted, "You! Tell those fools to!" Horror settled over his face as she realized what had happened to her pet. "No!" she cried. Then she spotted Prince Philip galloping across the creaking drawbridge. Samson leapt across the safety just as the bridge started to rise. Maleficent's eyes burned fury. Thrusting her arm forward, she sent a lightning bolt from her sharp, bony finger. It smashed against a stone archway just ahead of the prince. Samson whined in fear, but kept going, and Prince Philip held up his enchanted shield, and the falling rocks knocked against it and fell to the ground. Samson raced off the castle grounds. Ahead of him was a crevice in the earth, just narrow enough to leap over. Crack! Maleficent hurled another bolt and hit the crevice, opening it too wide to cross. Horse and rider slid downward on a steep pile of rocks and dirt, and Samson struggled to keep upright. He hit the bottom on all fours and, leaping up from the ravine on all his strength, made it to the other side. The fairies followed him, 3 specks of bright light. Maleficent watched, her rage boiling inside her. If the prince wanted a fight, she was ready for him. She raised her staff high and chanted, "A forest of thrones shall be his tomb, born to the skies on a fog of doom. Now go with a curse and serve me well. Round Stephen's castle, cast my spell." Prince Philip dug his heels into Samson's flanks. He could see King Stephen's castle in the distance, and there was only a few miles left. Crack! Maleficent's lightning coated the countryside in blinding whiteness. For a moment, Prince Philip could see nothing. He shielded his eyes and pulled back on Samson's reins. When his eyes recovered, he no longer saw the castle. A black forest of thorny vines now blocked his view. The vines were rising upward at an uncanny speed, whirling around each other, choking off all light. They hardened and thickened, and the thorns became as sharp as daggers. No ordinary sword could possibly cut these vines, but Prince Philip's blade glowed with the magic of the fairies. He rolled forward at full speed, swinging all his might. Whack! His sword sliced cleanly through a vine. It fell to the ground with a heavy thump. Whack, whack, whack. Vine after vine tumbled away. With each thrust, the prince fought his way ever closer to the castle. Far behind him, Maleficent stared in disbelief. "It cannot be," she said. In a weary whirl, the witch rose into the air. She hurled herself across the countryside, landing in front of Prince Philip in a blazing ball of fire. Samson reared at the flames. The prince struggled to keep him steady. "Now you shall deal with me, O prince," Maleficent thundered, "and all the powers of evil." She disappeared into the ball of fire, which began to swell. The prince drew back his sword. The fairies looked on, terrified at whatever might happen next. Boom! An explosion shook the ground, and the ball of fire seemed to swallow everything around it, as if Maleficent had suddenly brought the sun to the earth. Then in the midst of the jumping flames, Maleficent's figure shot upward and transformed into a huge dragon. Its head leaned higher than the highest tree. Its eyes were a fiery orange. Its deep violet scales, violet, were glinting like armor. Each time it breathed, its mouth spewed a roaring column of fire. The heat of its breath knocked Prince Philip off Samson, who galloped away in terror. Ah! A fiery blast shot toward the prince. He scrambled behind a thicket of vines. By the silence that followed, he could tell the dragon had lost sight of him. He waited, watching the shadow of the dragon's head coming closer and closer. At the last moment, the prince jumped out of hiding with a solid whack. He struck the dragon over the head. The sword bounced off, blowing with anger and pain. The dragon blew fire over the entire forest. Flames rose from the ground, surrounding Prince Philip on all sides. "Up!" came Flora's voice from above. "Up this way!" Philip looked around to see his only path of escape, up the smooth cliff untouched by flames. Digging in with his fingers, he scrambled to the top. The prince barely had time to get to his feet before the dragon materialized before him. Now, it too stood on the cliff. Prince Philip was trapped. If he moved backward, he would fall over the cliff into a bed of flames. The dragon lunged toward him. He opened his mouth, and to draw a breath, Prince Philip raised his magic shield. Ah! The flame hit the shield with a volley of a cannon. The shield flew out of the prince's hand and over the cliff. He held up his sword, but it was of little use. The heat was now too great for him to get close to the dragon. He drew back his arm. He took aim at the dragon's head. Above him, the fairies hovered anxiously together. They sent a flurry of magic dust toward his sword. Flora quickly chanted, "Sword of truth, fly swift and sure, that evil die and good endure." Philip threw the sword, and it sliced through the air, its point gleaming with the good magic of the fairies. For a moment, it seemed to disappear into the flames. But an anguished screech of the dragon left no doubt where the sword had landed. Staggering forward, the dragon opens its huge mouth. The sword was buried deep in its heart. It bared its teeth and lurched toward the prince, ready to swallow him whole. Prince Philip ducked away. The giant jaw snapped shut inches from his face. The dragon, winking with pain, could not stop itself from falling forward. With a bellow that seemed to blot out all the sounds on the earth, the dragon plunged over the cliff to its fiery death. The prince looked over the edge. He could see the shank of his sword among the simmering flames. Impaled on the sword was a black cape. It was all that remained of Maleficent. Chapter 10. We are in the last chapter, Joss. The prince sank to his knees. His chest heaved with exhaustion, and his eyes burned from the smoke. Around him fluttered 3 white lights. The prince knew that the fairies had saved his life. Someday he would thank them. But right now, no words could escape his parched throat. Beside him, sniffing curiously, was Samson. He had returned to his master. For the first time in his capture, Prince Philip smiled. Then he noticed more movement around him. The thorny vines were shrieking, dissolving back into the ground. The fire blew out like the candles on a birthday cake. The smoke vanished into the sky, and the sun shone bright and brilliant and warm. The fairies smiled. Jumping up and down excitingly, rising before them, no longer hidden by thorns and fire, was King Stephen's castle. It gleamed as it washed by a spring rain, and its gates stood open. Inside, the courtiers and townspeople were still fast asleep. Prince Philip walked past them and climbed the steps to the room in which Aurora lay sleeping. The prince pushed the door open. His breath caught in his throat. She was almost as lovely asleep as she was awake. The prince was overcome with the desire to look into her eyes again. He knelt beside her, planted a soft kiss on her lips. The fairies held their breath. Slowly, Aurora's eyes flickered once, then twice. When they caught sight of Prince Philip, they opened fully. Then a warm smile brought the princess's face back to life. Bursting with happiness, the fairies squealed and hugged each other. "Come, you two," Flora said happily to the couple, "to the royal court." All over the castle, people began to stir. Arms stretched and mouths yawned. In the throne room, a groggy King Stephen picked up his head. "Oh, forgive me," he said to King Hubert, who was yawning beside him. "You were saying something about Philip?" "Huh?" King Philip and King Hubert mumbled. "Oh, yes. Well, to come to the point, my son Philip says he's going to marry a blare of a trumpet fanfare cut him off. All eyes focused on the top of the grand stairway. Ooh. Prince Philip and Prince Aurora appeared, arm in arm, beaming with joy that lit up the room. King Stephen rose to his feet, his heart filled with happiness. His daughter was alive and well, and more beautiful than he could have imagined. "It's Aurora!" he cried. King Hubert rubbed his eyes. And Philip! The young couple approached the throne. Queen Leah's eyes brimmed with tears of relief. The years of worry seemed to rise from deep within her and fly away. When Aurora got close to the queen, she could restrain herself no longer. She ran into Leah's arms, and she received an embrace that poured 16 years of a mother's love into her heart. Aww. Around them, the courtiers and the town people burst into applause. It was the happiest day any of them have ever known. The couple hugged and kissed King Stephen, then King Hubert. "Wait, what does this mean, boy?" King Hubert asked his son, still confused. But the court musicians had struck up a dance, and Prince Philip whisked the princess away to the dance floor. "I don't understand," King Hubert muttered. Then with a sigh, he shrugged his shoulders and swayed to the music. From a balcony high above, the fairies watched the prince and the princess dance. Fauna sobbed uncontrollably. "Why, what's the matter, dear?" Flora asked. Fauna sniffed. "Oh, I just love happy endings." "Yes, I do too," Flora said. She turned contently to see Aurora soaring gracefully, her dress a whirl of sky blue. "Blue? What do you think's about to happen?" She blurted, her contentment disappearing, and zing! She waved her wand, and she turned it pink. Now Merryweather's smile disappeared. "Blue!" she demanded. Zing! went her wand. I think we're about to see a fairy fight. What do you think? On the dance floor, Aurora looked lovely into her eyes of her prince. Her dress flashed pink and blue in a swirl of motion. But to her, everyone around her, it was just another magical part of this most magical dream come true. Yay! So that is the end of Sleeping Beauty. So what color would you have wanted Aurora's dress? Blue or pink? Jocelyn's probably a pink person, but she likes blue too. So next week, we're going to feature a very special princess that a lot of y'all know. Her name is Cinderella. Bitti-bitti, boppity-boo. So we will see you next week. I hope you'll join us. And thank you for joining us for these long videos of Sleeping Beauty this week. I hope you enjoyed this. And I will love to see you like the video and subscribe to our channel for more story times with Jocelyn. She smiled for you. And have a blessed day. And we will see you next week for Bippity Boppity